Hello and welcome to Django DRF Query Fundamentals course. My name is Xander. Now this tutorial is part of a whole course playlist available for free on YouTube. If you do like this course and you want to delve deeper, the full course is available for purchase at Udemy. Again, find all the resources and links in this video's description. Do remember to subscribe to the channel for weekly promotions, discounts, and of course Udemy course giveaways. Now that we have, in the previous tutorial, learned some of the basics of working with view sets, let's now go ahead and learn how to insert the data into single tables with create method and save. So let's remember, a view set is a class-based view that groups common API actions, list, create, retrieve, update, delete, and create operations to allow clients to send data, usually in JSON format, to insert records into the database. We're going to be working with the category table, but you can apply what you learned in this tutorial to any of these tables in our database. So do have a go once you completed this tutorial, maybe replicating the code, try and create endpoints for other tables. Our focus here then is on the create action in the view set. This is going to direct a HTTP post request to this function to perform the logic that we define within this function. Right, so I have commented out the previous code. I will leave that there for reference if you are looking at the source code for this module. Right, so this is going to be an example one. Example one, inserting data with create and save. Right, so first of all, we're going to need to create a new class. Right, so let's call this class category insert. That's the action we're going to perform, and then we'll call this view set. So there's going to be a category insert view set. Okay, so we go ahead and import our view set, and now we can go ahead and define or override the methods. So here in the view set we have the create method, which will allow us to override the action or what happens when the user sends a HTTP post request to this endpoint. So let's go ahead and include the request data. Right, so first of all, let's go ahead and define the serializer that we're going to use. So the serializer is going to be called category insert serializer, or maybe it's just category serializer. Either way, it's not there. We did create a serializer previously. It was what we call it, inventory category. Okay, so let's change the name of this to just category serializer for now, and let's just make sure that we have this imported, and then we go ahead and utilize this serializer. There we go. So that's our serializer defined. Right, so the client is going to send a request. In this case, they're going to send a post request to our server. Okay, and at the moment, we know that this request will ultimately be handled by the create function that we created. Okay, so eventually it's going to make its way over to this create function we created. So what we're going to need to do with the data that's sent in this post, so this data that's sent in this post request, we're going to need to serialize it. So as well as defining our serializer, we're going to pass in the data that's sent with the request. So data equals the request dot data. Okay, so that's the data that's sent in the HTTP request from the client. Okay, so we're going to need to know that that data actually meets the requirements of our serializer. Imagine the client wants to store data in the category table, but it sends us a load of different data that doesn't match or meet the expectation of our serializer. So in that case, of course, the data will fail. We won't be able to store in the database, so we will retrieve or receive an error when we try to serialize that data if it isn't sent in the format we expect from this endpoint. So we want to make sure that before we save the data into the database, we want to make sure that it is valid. So we have the isValid method that we can run with our serializer. Okay, so this is going to check to see if the data that is sent in the request from the client is valid. If it is valid, of course, what we can now do is run the serializer.save method. So that's going to save the data into the database. Right, so what we can also do now is just a return. So we return a response, and what we can do, we can send the data back. So serializer.data, and then we can also send a status, a HTTP status. So let's define that manually, status dot, and then we're going to send a HTTP request, a 201 request back. Right, so a HTTP 201 is specific to HTTP 201 created. Okay. Yes, we need to import status from the REST framework. So from REST framework, let's go ahead and import. I'll get this right. Import status. There we go. The HTTP status code is a standard response sent by a web server to indicate the outcome of the client's request. It is part of the HTTP protocol response and helps the client or browser or API consumer to understand whether their request was successful or not. So if there was an error or if further action is required, HTTP status codes are grouped into 5 classes based upon their first digit. So there are quite a few status codes, and you're probably not going to remember them all, but it's useful to know at least some of the basic, and here you can see a list of the most common HTTP status codes, most of which we're going to be utilizing in this course. So the reason we are sending back a 201 HTTP status code is because that's going to indicate to the client that the resource was successfully created. Right, so we've now set out the actions if the data is valid, but of course we need to also tell the client if they were to send us data that isn't going to be validated or wasn't validated successfully via our serializer. So for that we want to return a new or different type of response, and that would be well, we can return back the error from the serializer if we wanted to, as well as then change the status to something more appropriate. And in that case, I think a HTTP 400 would be a good idea. So that's a bad request. So that's the standard code 400 for a request that was malformed or invalid. Okay, so hopefully we've got the general overview of what's happening here within this viewpoint. Let's just focus in on save for a few seconds. So in Django, the save method is a built-in function used to persist an instance of a model to the database. So this method is automatically available for all Django models, and it is used to either insert a new record or update an existing one in the database. So save is going to do one of two things. It's going to insert a new record if the model instance, if the row or data doesn't exist in the database. Now it will also update an existing record. So if the model instance already exists, it has a primary key, Django will perform an update SQL query to modify the corresponding row in the database. Okay, so we have the view, we have the serializer. Now we are going to need to configure the URL. Now for every single view set that we create, we are going to need to create a URL for it. So to connect our URL to the view set and the logic within. Now that gets a little bit tedious, so I'm going to show you an automated approach which is going to automatically find the view sets within our view and automatically register them with the router. Right, so head over to the URLs, and first of all we're going to import all of the views. So from dot, let's just go ahead and import views. So that's going to import everything, or make everything available inside of our views. Right, there we go. Next up, we need to initiate the default router, happy days, and now we need to add our routes to the router, and that's what we're going to do automatically. So we're going to remove the previous command, which registered an individual view to the router, and we'll keep the URL patterns for now, but we will need to change that shortly. So the goal of this script that we're going to create here is to extract the name of the views that we've generated as, or subclassing from ViewSet, and then generate the routes for them automatically, so we don't have to keep adding them when we create more views in our views module. So we're going to try and extract the name. So we're going to use get members. Okay, so CLS in get members. So get members is from Python's inspect module. So I've imported get members and is class from the inspect module. So this returns all members, so functions, classes, and other resources of our views module. So we pass in the views module that we're working on, and we define is class. So this is a filter. This ensures that we only get the classes defined in the views. Okay, so then we use if is subclass. So this checks if the class is a subclass of the view set. So in this case, it is the case. So the classes that we create will be inheriting from view sets. So they will be, like I said, they will be subclasses of DRF's view set class. And so we use an and here because we also want to make sure that we only work with classes that we define. We don't want to work with any modules that's been imported in. So ensure here that we're only registering classes defined in the views module and not other modules that might have been imported into the views. Okay, so now we're ready to register our new endpoints. So for that, we use this RF name lower replace view set empty. So this registers the view set with the router. So the first argument in this pattern here, this will determine how the view set will be accessed. So here we're trying to create, remember, the endpoint URL for our new route. So we're going to grab the view set name and just delete the word view set or replace the word view set. Why am I doing that? Because sometimes we import the view set from view set here, like this type of method, viewset.viewset. We're not doing that in this instance, but that might be the case in other examples. So we're just going to add that in for now, so just to replace that, and that's going to leave us with the name that we're going to convert into lowercase, and that's going to create the endpoint URL for the individual views or classes, sorry, that we create. And then we will need to set the base name. So again, that's going to be very simple. So it's just going to be the name of the class in lowercase. And then once we've done that, we can go ahead and update the URL patterns. So we're going to add a prefix for all of the endpoints we create. So we're going to find them within API slash, and this is module 4. So we're going to create a new directory called module 4 slash, and then after that slash will then be the name of our class, and that's how we're going to access the individual endpoints. Right, so once you've done that, let's go ahead and just restart the containers. You can use build or not, so docker compose with build. Wait for a few seconds. If you still need any of the commands, don't forget you can access all the commands here in the commands markdown file. Some of the commands maybe I've missed out, but I've tried to add the majority of the commands that we're going to use or have used. So once that's in place, let's go ahead and refresh. So it looks like we do have access to the endpoint here, but notice that we don't have any parameters. So this is a post request, so we should be sending data to our endpoint, and it's not allowing us to at this point. We don't have any options, there's no parameters. So we are returning a 500 error because we are not sending any data. So we can inspect that further. If we go into our Django container, we can see here it looks like we have an error. Object has no attribute. Well, that's because we haven't sent any data. So the serializer is causing the error because we aren't sending any data. Right, so the problem here is that the tool that we're using for the endpoints to document our API, it doesn't have all the information it needs to know that we want to create some sort of method, we want to create some sort of approach so that we can actually enter parameters here and then test it with this tool. So to do that, we're going to need to extend the schema to include additional information so it's aware of what to expect and how to handle that, to then present a box or input fields or something so that we can input the data. Right, so let me just lift this in. Right, so here we're going to use extend schema. Right, so we're going to need to import that from the DRF spectacular utilities. I would do exactly that. Okay, so extend schema, and this is going to allow us to provide additional information. Right, so here we have defined the request equals category serializer. So this links the serializer for the request body. And then we are going to, in our case, send data back to the client in the response. So we want to make sure that data is prepared appropriately through our serializer so it can then be converted into JSON to send back to the client. So here we also define the response serializer, the category serializer. Now you may have a separate serializer because you might not want to send all the data back. You may only want to send the category name, for example, back. So that can be managed through the serializer. In addition to that, we also add a tag. So this is going to allow us to organize all of the different examples that we create through the different modules. So let's see this in action. So if you do a refresh, you should now see module 4, and we have one endpoint connected to that. And if I were to now try this out, you can now see I have this request body option where I can then now test and try out the endpoint. Right, so we need to remember that parent is optional. That's an optional field within our database. So I'm going to remove that. And then let's just make sure we change the data here just in case it has already been inserted. And then we can go ahead and execute. So we can actually test this endpoint out now. And you can see that we return the 201. You can see within the response body from the server, we have the data. That's the data that is returned, that's been deserialized and returned back to the client. So it's important to note that I mentioned that we can change the data that's returned. So if I change this to, for example, category return serializer, so let's just, it doesn't exist yet, but let's go ahead and just add that in. So I'm going to, let's just copy the previous serializer here. There are different approaches, but I'm just going to create a separate serializer for this, and I just want to return this time just the name and maybe just the name and the slug. Okay, so I've just changed the data that's deserialized back to the client. Right, so with that change, let's just run this again and see this in action. So let's just change this slightly so it's a unique name and slug, which was required. I execute that, and this time we return, it looks like some sort of error now that we are receiving. So category serializer, so it looks like we have some sort of error. So this is a common misconception. Because we have specified the serializer in the response in the extended schema, that does not automatically serialize the data. The response's argument in extend schema is simply a way to document the expected structure of the response for that endpoint. So this specifically is used for generating open API schema information, which can then be utilized within our docs UI to generate the interface that we need so that we can interact and view endpoints and other information. what we need to do in actual fact is in the response, remember we have defined serializer.data. So here we are simply defining that we want to use the serialized data from the initial serialization of it that was done by the category serializer. So what we're going to need to do here is serialize the newly created data into the return serializer, or use the return serializer for that. And then we can, so we just need to change this. So this is going to be category instance equals serialize.save. So we're going to take that data that is saved, and then we're going to return that in the response. So return serializer data in the response. So we're simply going to now serialize with the return serializer. And this time you can see that we're only going to utilize the name and slug. And that's what we're going to send back to the client. So this time, well, let's do a refresh. Okay, so let's try out the endpoint again. Let's add in something a little bit unique for the name and slug, so we're not trying to duplicate data. Press execute, and this time we still get an error. Okay. Now what this does highlight is that there are plenty of different types of errors that might occur when using your endpoint, and at this point we are not capturing them. Now in this course we're not going to go into that level of capturing different validation errors and exceptions, but that is something for you to consider. Now if you take a look at go over to our inventory models, let's not forget that here the slug has a maximum length of 55. So the error that we are actually receiving here is because we are actually trying to insert a character or a string that is more than 55 characters. That is what the error is. So I'm not going to count them, but potentially we have more than 55 characters here. So let's just reduce this down, and then let's go ahead and execute. And this time you can see that we were successful. And in actual fact, we are now utilizing the category return serializer to only return the name and the slug. Okay, so there was a lot there for us to learn, but hopefully now that we have that framework, as we move deeper into this course, there is less and less for us to learn regarding DRF, and we can concentrate solely on learning how to interact with the database. I will try and find a balance between giving you enough information and maybe additional information about DRF, as well as obviously try and focus in on the core learning aspects interacting with the database. Now I do recommend you spending some time now creating some additional endpoints using new ViewSet classes, generate some new classes in your views, and try and insert data into other tables. So generate or create some different serializers for the different tables, and try and go ahead and actually create some data for those individual tables. The more you become comfortable with the code that we've just demonstrated and created, the easier it's going to be later on in this course and this module.